Sabrin, who is an Islamic philosopher, researcher, and mechanical engineer. Her research focus is on the field of religion, philosophy, and sciences. She holds a master's in philosophy and is currently pursuing a PhD, where her research delves into quantum physics, consciousness, and the fine-tuned universe from the Islamic perspective. Safia is the director of the Second Golden Age, a multimedia project that revisits the Muslim scientific revolution inspired by the Quran and explores the ways to inspire a contemporary revival. Her work extends into media production, having collaborated with a UAE-based media house to produce a documentary on the Islamic Golden Age. She is the director of a Homa Civilizational Dialogue and Harmony Foundation. And Safia will be presenting to us at Epistemic Colonialism in the Study of Oriental Scientific Heritage. Just to give you a brief background, epistemic colonialism has different forms, and each of these forms undermines the ideas, cultures, and heritage of colonized groups. Intellectual imperialism and its six traits as recognized by Al Attas, elucidate on the ubiquity of epistemic colonialism. The history of science is an era where the various dynamics of epistemic colonialism can be identified. One of these dynamics is the erasure of the scientific legacy of non-European cultures which serve colonial objectives in multiple ways. This study highlights some of the areas in which this has come to light. Findings of Otto Neugebauer and William Hartner in the field of the history of astronomy will be discussed in this context. Simon Schaffer identifies one significant application of this erasure as being a form of psychological manipulation of colonized people. This can be best examined in the context of colonization of the Indian subcontinent. This study contributes to the identification of epistemic violence, its negative impact on the scientific developments of this nation. And you can take it from here, Safia. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for giving me this opportunity. So I'm just gonna share my screen. Alright, so I'm going to be discussing the epistemic colonialism in the study of the Oriental scientific heritage. So this is a particular case study that I'm going to be undertaking, how epistemic colonialism actually manifested in this field, and it led to various serious repercussions. So the agenda would be to introduce epistemic colonization in the history of science in particular, because science is power, and whoever controls the discourse of science and its history has that power, and I'm going to show that. I'm going to be using Syed Farid Al Attas' 6 traits of intellectual imperialism, just to give you an introduction on what exactly how exactly this can be applied to the history of science. The curious case of Copernicus and the scientific revolution, because Copernicus happens to be an extremely important figure in understanding the history of European or modern or contemporary science, and the erasure of non-European science as a tool of epistemic colonialism and violence. And at the end, I will give you a simple solution to the issue. Now, the introduction has been shared, so I wouldn't go into that, but just one, little bit on that I'm going to be concentrating on the dynamics of this deliberate and concerted erasure of the scientific legacy of non-European cultures, which served colonial objectives. It had an actual objective in mind, and that's what it wasn't just racism or just arrogance. No, it had a particular objective in mind which served colonial benefits. And I'm going to be using a particular case study with Copernicus as we move on. So I've given a very simple definition of how epistemic colonialism actually manifests in the history of science. So one could have it this way: it's a concerted and deliberate attempt to undermine, erase, and misrepresent the contributions of non-European scientists in the development of contemporary science. Just to completely forget about, as if non-Europeans never really actually contributed positively or in a great manner in the production of contemporary science. Yes, they were there, and they were like the pre-scientific primitive cultures, but not really active engagement as we see as is actually the case. So just a little bit of introduction on this. I'm sure most of you would know this. So this is Syed Farid Al Attas' 6 traits of intellectual imperialism, and we can see that they all apply to even the history of science, a particular field like the history of science. So exploitation, the trait number 1, in imperialism, whether it's actual imperialism, intellectual imperialism, or intellectual imperialism in the field of history of science. So it is one of the traits is exploitation. Trait number 2 is tutelage. This idea of the people, the people that are dominated, they are considered a kind of a ward within a tutelage system. You try, the colonizer or the colonial powers actually try to tutor the other civilizations and the other cultures into what exactly science is and how you didn't have it, we had it. And conformity is that then this is made a very significant part of the curriculum. So everybody is studying the same thing for generation after generation, wherein you're in a state that you cannot even think of an alternative view. Now, trait number 4 would be the dominated people will play a secondary role in the setup. And if we see, we don't have to really go far away. We can actually see that in the production of science, the scientific enterprise or contemporary science, the dominated people are actually, the colonized people play a secondary role. However, if a completely different methodology were to be used, we would see an active engagement or maybe an equal or even sometimes even more engagement from colonized communities to the production of science. And the existence of intellectual rationalization, which is an attempt to explain imperialism as a necessary stage in human progress, and that the business of the imperialist power is to civilize the people under subjugation. So this idea that the Western colonial powers actually are one of the biggest milestones in human intellectual progress, and it could not have been any other culture other than the white man who could have brought this great change in the human understanding of science, of the world, and of progress in general. And lastly, the imperialist rulers, this subjugated country is very often run by inferior talents. So the system is actually perpetuated and it is sustained, wherein it is, it's kept as safe as possible by including it in the syllabi after generation after generation in public discourse, in media, so that and the people who are doing this is not really directly the imperialist powers, but it's our own indigenous native people. So if there was a quote that actually, represented this kind of a epistemology, this kind of an epistemic violence of this sort, it would be this: that a single shelf of a good European library was worth the whole native literature of India and Arabia. So that actually represents, that literally reeks of this epistemic violence that we know of, whereas the opposite of it is true. And that's why it's so important to discuss this, because we are being manipulated into thinking something which is the opposite. The opposite is true. It was India and Arabia that actually led to that single shelf or multiple shelves or libraries full of European literature. Now, let's go specifically to this particular case, the Copernicus narrative, I call it. And Copernicus is very important because he represents this kind of a paradigm changer with his heliocentrism. He's the father of the scientific revolution. He represents a triumph of scientific objectivity over religious or mystical conceptions. Copernicus is that big milestone that the Western conceptions of the history of science consider in the history of intellectual thought. So, but who is Copernicus? Is he really the founder of the scientific revolution, or a European member of the Moraga astronomical tradition? Moraga used to be a very famous observatory in Central Asia. Now it's in Iran. Now, I want to share with you this 1 minute clip, if I can, of my documentary on on the Islamic Golden Age, but one little part on Copernicus.
But after But after paying our respects to this great scientist, we want to go deeper into how he arrived at this radical conclusion. There had been people before him who had proposed a sun-centric universe, but he had provided planetary models to substantiate his views. And more importantly, his book is considered the biggest triumph of science over dogmatic religion and ushered in the scientific revolution. It was not until 1957 that Austrian mathematician and historian of science Otto Neugebauer found striking similarities between the lunar model of Copernicus and that of Muslim astronomer Ibn Shatir, written some 200 years back. Copernicus had also incorporated the geometric solutions of other Muslim astronomers like Nasiruddin al-Tusi and al-Urdi. Add to this the discovery of German scientist and polymath Willi Hartner in 1975 that even the diagrams are same detail by detail, down to their alphabetical designation. Where Tusi uses Aleph, Copernicus uses A. Where Tusi uses Ba, Copernicus uses B, and so on. So the question then is, did Copernicus really start the scientific revolution?
As we just saw, that there was a narrative of Copernicus, surrounding Copernicus as this central figure in the intellectual history of the world in general and of Europe in particular. But that kind of narrative has been completely negated by discoveries in the 20th century. So much so that in academic language, what Copernicus actually did, as pointed by Willi Hartner, is that even the designations were the same. So he uses a very polite word for saying that the borrowing by Copernicus of the Tusi couple, in as much as the lettering in Copernicus's diagram in his book De Revolutionibus follows the standard Arabic lettering rather than what one might expect in Latin. So he's even copied everything. Even the lettering is the same. So in academic parlance, this is intellectual, plagiarism. So we have here somebody who is considered the father, the founder of the scientific revolution, actually being a plagiarist. So what remains of that narrative now? So this is not just about the person of Copernicus. Instead, it has more to do with the narrative that was created around him. Developments of the 16th and 17th century in Europe were popularized as major landmarks in human history and indicators of the white man's superiority over humanity. So this narrative rested on lies and plagiarism, and thus it needs to be completely replaced. Now, why is it important? Why is it important? Because it led to what can be called the most sinister form of epistemic violence and colonialism. So Simon Schaeffer here, he actually makes a very important point. He says Europeans in the colonial period were prepared to acknowledge that in ancient times, Islam had achieved great things in science, but Islam, India, China, all of these non-European cultures in science, but they weren't doing so now. Even recent Islamic astronomy was imagined to be very old, because if it were very old, it meant that the culture the British were conquering was declining, and for the British that was clearly good news in the sense that this psychological manipulation that yes, you were advanced, but that was very primitive. Now it's our age. Now you are in decline and we are in progress, which is all based on lies and psychological manipulation. And lastly, I want to leave you with a solution that just the way actual colonization worked and people fought against it, we had very important figures, the freedom fighters who fought against it. That's the exact same thing that we need to do in academia, because it's academics who actually realized this, that okay, this form of colonialism actually still exists. So it has to be on the individual and academic level that we need to counter this. And lastly, if you want to connect with me, I actually direct the Second Golden Age project, where I talk more about this, and Civilizational Dialogue and Harmony Foundation. I'm the director of that. You can connect with me on LinkedIn. Thank you so much.
Is there anyone who would like to ask? Yes, Professor Alatas.
Yeah, well, if I had asked so many questions before, but since no one is asking, maybe I'll I don't mean to take everyone's time. I just have a couple of questions. One for Hamisu. I was interested in indigenous concepts. I'm interested in indigenous or local concepts. And in your presentation, you mentioned something interesting, something different from what we've heard before. This president that you were talking about, he spoke about a rusty way of thinking. So I'm wondering, of course, rusty here is a metaphor, but I'm wondering what that exactly means. What does a rusty way of thinking mean? If you could explain that. And then for Fives Valdez, you presented an account which on historical materialism, which I'm sympathetic to. Your presentation, it's important. I think there have been many works that look at the marginalization or omission of Muslim and Hindu and Chinese contributions to the various sciences, but I think we don't have enough systematic works that actually do that, and they're reflected in academic writings, in specialist writings, but they're not reflected in textbooks. Textbooks on the history of science or on the history of mathematics or theoretical introductions to theory in different disciplines. So perhaps what needs to be done is making some incursions into the way we actually teach in the universities, which means rewriting textbooks and reformulating, revamping curricula, revamping the syllabi. So I was wondering whether you know of examples of that being done in your own context. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Alatas. And before we answer, I just want to remind our presenter to kindly answer it in a brief manner because there are other questions coming up, so we can accommodate it as well.
Yeah, I think I'm next. Thank you so much for the question, Professor. I'm very honored. That's a very valid question. Obviously, there are many people who have discussed this, and why I chose Copernicus in particular, as I said, is because he is not just a scientist. He has a complete narrative around him, but there are so many other places that we find the same kind of erasure, omission that there is. As far as I'm aware, there are efforts in Pakistan to incorporate some things like this in school textbooks. As far as I'm aware, there is this kind of an awareness in Pakistan. I'm in India, so we don't have that, but there is an awareness even in Indian academics to study medieval and even ancient Indian mathematicians and their contributions, but it hasn't really reached the masses, leave apart the masses, even school level. So it's still either at very high level in academia, in research, or it's just sometimes in public discourse. So we have a documentary here, a film here, something like that. So if that answers your question.
Thank you so much. And we have more questions in the chat. Nuruddin, would you want to speak? And or do you want me to read? Yeah, okay. Thanks.
Yes. Can you hear me? Because my signal is not so good. Yeah. So maybe I write in the chat if I can. Says that I have two questions. First for Professor Shafia. My first question is about did Omar Khayyam and Al-Biruni also contribute to the development of the theory of heliocentrism in classical Islamic world? Yeah, besides Nasruddin Tusi. And my second question is.
Javier, would you want to respond? These are very interesting questions.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. I'll just go ahead with uh, the first one. You said about Umar Khayyam and Al-Biruni. Yes, that's true. They did express, if I'm not wrong, about Al-Biruni, and Umar Khayyam was a contemporary. They did discuss the possibility of actually changing the position of the geocentric model and modifying it. So we do understand that there was this drive to go against Ptolemy's model in the medieval Muslim world, and they were trying to look at alternative models. We find that in Ibn Shatir as well, and in Al-Biruni. And heliocentrism is actually a very old, it's a Greek idea as well. Aristarchus has talked about it way before Copernicus. But